This time in Basics for Beginners, we're going to take a look at working with type practically.
TipTut.
This series was recorded during the coronavirus scare, and due to spacing issues in the house, we'll have no webcam. Sorry about that, but hopefully you can still learn something from this tutorial series. Hello everybody and welcome back to TipTut and welcome back to Basics for Beginners. Today we are working with type practically, or largely what we're working with is paragraphs. Now, before we've explored, what makes up a character, what makes up a word, what is the terminology for all of this stuff, but today we're going to talk about how to actually work with text in a real life document. Yeah. What if somebody gives you a buttload of text and says, turn this into a brochure? Yeah. How do we do that? What's the best practices for that? So let's talk about paragraph construction. Paragraphs are really important because they help divide your large bodies of text into well presented, easily manageable chunks that won't intimidate your audience. Yeah. So a well-formed paragraph will be roughly rectangular in shape. I know that makes sense because when you draw a text box, for example, it comes out as a box, and within inside that box, you draw lines of text. Yeah. However, sometimes you can get these really ragged edges on a shape, which don't make it look very good. Yeah, they look a bit better once they've been squared off a little bit. There are several factors that affect whether or not it's going to be a square or roughly rectangular. Yeah. So let's take a look at what those are so that we can either avoid or not avoid them based on our preference. So word spacing, the gaps between the words. Usually you just hit the space bar and there you go. That's your gap, right? But there's more to it than that. The default setting is usually presented as 0. Yeah. But so when you've got a sliding scale or whatever in Illustrator, it's going to be at 0 and that's going to be default. But what that is really based on is the width of a lowercase n or o within that font face. Yeah. So this O, for example, here is going to be similar to the same width of the space within the word. That's done because that's generally considered enough space to differentiate between words. Good word spacing helps the reader's eye flow through the document in a natural manner. Generally speaking, the larger the font, the smaller word spacing you can use, but it's definitely an art, not a science. And you should experiment and make sure to check it with different people. Largely, you can leave it on the default setting, but make sure that lots of people can understand your word spacing when you show it to them. So let's show some examples then. Normal word spacing. This is an example of content with normal word spacing. The gap between each word is the same and guides the viewer through the text naturally. When you justify text, which you've probably seen in some documents, it has sporadic word spacing as it tries to accommodate the text to fit the box. It can be considered distracting, especially when you leave the last line justified as well. Very ugly, more difficult to read. I think I have duplicated that slide. That was silly of me. So let's talk about then alignments, rags, widows, and orphans. It's a horribly depressing naming system, I know, but we have to go through it. So aligning text to a margin is a common practice. Yeah, you're probably already familiar with left align, middle align, right align, justify, etc. So let's cover all the bases just quickly. Left aligned, otherwise known as rag right, and that's because the right-hand side of these paragraphs is ragged. Yeah, ragged. Hence rag right. It's probably the most common alignment, at least in the Western world, where we do read left to right. Obviously, if you're in Asia and they read right to left, then that's not going to be the most common one. It leaves the right-hand side ragged, and it's referred to as rag right. It's great for readability in the Western world. Center-aligned, rag left and right. It works better for short lines of text, such as titles or subtitles or taglines, anything that only has a few words in it. Much more than that, and if it extends over several lines, it just becomes difficult to read. Right-aligned rag left is often used for additional information or to make certain blocks of text stand out. Say, for example, you have a page document like so, and you've got a title up here, and you've got a whole bunch of text filling up your page. Yeah. All left aligned. If you had some right aligned text in the bottom right corner, automatically your eye is going to be drawn to that. Make sense? Good. Justified then has no rag. It spreads the text evenly between two margins, which can make it look neat, but it can also lead to uneven gaps between the words, which are referred to as rivers. If it's done badly, you might have like a sort of line through your text that does this. Yeah. There's just this weird gap where there's no words either side. And that's called a river. For large bodies of text, use left align text and manually adjust the word spacing and line breaks to create a smoother right rag. Okay. We'll talk about a little bit more about that in a second. So what are widows and orphans then? They're depressing and lonely words, first of all, but when you justify or when you don't use proper spacing, you can be left with individual words that stand on their own lines. Any stranded word at the bottom of a paragraph is referred to as a widow because it's left its family behind. And those at the top of a page or a column are known as orphans. Now, orphans are less common because it would have to be sort of 2 columns of text like this. And you'd have line after line after line after line after line, and then a single word up here, and then line after line after line after line. That would be an orphan. Yeah. Whereas a widow would be 1 word just by itself at the bottom of a paragraph, which is obviously a lot more common. You don't want them because they just look ugly and they mess up the structure of your document. So how do you fix things like ragged orphans and all sorts of stuff like that? Well, you do it with leading, tracking, and kerning. The 3 ways to adjust the gaps between your letters. That's how to think about it. Leading. Read between the lines. A fun fact about this is that it actually comes from physical strips of lead that typographers would put in between, like a line of those metal blocks I talked about earlier, in order to space out a line, which is really cool. A good starting point, and usually a default in a lot of design software, is it should be 120% of your font size. So a font size of 12 points, for example, would have a leading of 14.4 points. The more you increase that, the text will feel looser, less related to each other, and more like airy. If that's something you want to go for, great. If you're going for readability, you shouldn't be doing that. Kerning then, the cause of many misunderstandings. Good kerning allows you to read this word correctly, burn. Bad kerning causes you to read the word, possibly, as bum. So kerning refers to the gaps between individual characters in a proportional font. So some fonts, especially when using a title, require you to tweak this in order to achieve a more pleasing result. The larger your font size, the more likely you will have to do custom kerning. Unless it's your specific intention, you should adjust it to be a pleasing difference, unless you're trying to do something like make a little visual gag. Yeah? Bad kerning can lead to unfortunate results. Tracking. We keep it loose and we keep it tight. Tracking is very similar to kerning, but can be thought as a global character spacing, whereas kerning is to do with individual letters. The difference between an L and an O might have specific kerning, yeah, whereas the general space between any character will have universal tracking. Adjusting the tracking will uniformly change the space, regardless of what those characters are. Loose tracking creates a sense of freedom, and tight crack. Wow, honestly, let's try that entire paragraph again. Loose tracking creates a sense of freedom, and tight tracking can be harder to read and seems and feels more oppressive. Let's talk about line lengths and columns of text. So how do we read? I mean, I bet you never asked yourself that before, but how do we as a human being read words? You'd think, I've missed a paragraph here again. Sorry, this is a terrible tutorial. You might think that we read words in a row. Yeah, that makes sense. We read from left to right and we read a word at a time and we read through the text, but that is not so. What actually happens is our eyes scan the length of an entire line of type from here to here. Yeah. And they pause briefly to record a few words at a time, usually 3 or 4. So they'll scan, go, yep, the line is that long. And then they'll take the words in the whole line in chunks of 3 or 4 words. They'll piece together the understanding, the entire line of the text using these 3 to 4 word chunks. And they do it all within a fraction of a second. Okay. And they've proven all this with all those, you can do it yourself, those fun word games where you read a sentence and then it tells you to go back and read it. And you'll notice that all of the letters are transposed. Yeah, and they're all in different places, but you can still understand it. That's because you're observing the word as a whole as opposed to the original characters. We can do this about 3 or 4 times per line of text before our brain gets fatigued. And then that's when you start to get like headaches when you're reading and it's difficult and you keep reading the same line over and over again. That's because there's bad line length. So what is the right line length? Usually, therefore, it's between about 9 and 12 words, or 45 and 75 characters works just fine for any left-align text, yeah? For justified text, you can push it slightly further because of the rectangular nature of the box, to around 12 to 15 words. If you use much more than it, then you risk uneven word spacing and rivers of white space running through your paragraphs. We talked about that already. Obviously, you can break these rules, but just be aware that you are breaking them when you're doing so. So, how does it actually affect line length then? What is the practical use of this? You have to consider the length of the words and content of the copy. For example, like a list of complicated ingredients on a package of medicine or food will tend to have longer words, yeah? Microcrystalline cellulose, for example. So you need to consider your line length there, because if it's too short, you might split some of these words, yeah? And you can't have microcryst and then a hyphen and then aline on the other side because it might confuse the person buying the tablets, which is obviously a bad thing to do. So you need to make sure that your line length here contains enough space to make sure that no individual ingredient is split over 2 lines, okay? That's an example of practical line length. On the other hand, if it's got lots of illustrations in your work or you're working for children, then you obviously want your line length to be really short because they don't have that power to process that amount of words that an adult does. Therefore, that will because obviously if you're writing for children as well, the words you're going to use will be more simple, yeah? They're going to be boat instead of like yacht, yeah? It might be, pea instead of petit pois. Yeah, that's an I. Naturally, these words are going to be shorter, and therefore, naturally, you need less space, which gives you more space for the nice, cute picture of a tiger. So, how much content is too content? How much content is too much content? How much information is too much content? You know what I mean. So you should use columns to organize your content on the page. It's a fantastic way to encourage your users to flow. Yeah. It's also great for establishing the hierarchy of information. So very important, somewhat important, not really important. Yeah. You can split this up into columns because somebody is probably going to read this column and then get bored and maybe read this column and then definitely get bored and not read that column. Yeah. So you've got to consider different things. How much information do you have to show? How can you best segment that information? And will your design benefit from a taller and thinner or wider and shorter composition? If this information is unimportant, get rid of it and consider just having that one central column where there is a short amount of text that the viewer will happily consume and therefore place greater emphasis on said amount of text. One last thing to talk about paragraphs then is indenting and breaking. Which is better? There's only one way to find out, and that's have them fight each other. So, number 1, indenting. Indenting the first line of a paragraph means adding this little bit of extra space here. And what this does is it creates like a break in the flow and drags the viewer's eye to that. Yeah. So that when you're scanning through a document like this, you see the break. You'll see a break. Yeah. The break in the flow encourages the user to continue reading. Not only does it tell them where the next line is, the next chapter is, the next paragraph is, it will help them actually flow through that document and encourage them to keep reading. Yeah. What do you do when you come to the end of this? Yeah. You take a break, you stop reading, and you consider the document again as a whole, and then you go, oh, there's more content over here. You might do that at the end of every single paragraph, unless you indent. Okay. A basic indent should be anywhere between 1/4 to 1/2 of an inch in generic column of text. Yeah, like in a normal 12-point column of text. An alternative technique is to break your paragraphs with a line space in between them. It gives a larger sense of freedom, but it risks making the content seem less related. So if this was a list of instructions, that would be good because it'll be step 1, it'd be step 2, it'd be step 3. Yeah, this might not work, step 1, 2, 3, because it's all too close together over here. Yeah. It uses more space on the page, so you shouldn't be used if white space is a commodity. And it's usually better if each paragraph is like a self-containing point as opposed to a continuous flowing point. Lastly then, drop caps. What are they? When to use them? So drop caps are like large decorative letters used on the first letter of the first paragraph of a large body of text. You see them all the time in older works where they spend ages drawing these really intricate illustrations for each drop cap. You see them a lot less nowadays as there's a tend towards minimalism, but they absolutely still have their place. They can usually be contained within an illustrative border or invisible or used by themselves, but if you do use them, their bounding box should be square. Yeah, like this. There should be no text overriding that. You can have that be like aligned if I use like a more obvious solution. You can have the text go like this, but it's generally not done. You can do it if you want though. So let's talk quickly about unique, decorative, and text outlines. Accommodating imagery, like what we just talked about, wrapping that text around the images, is something to do when you have a small amount of text in like a headline or a subtitle or something like that. And you want to make it take on a unique shape based on its surroundings. Okay, so this here is obviously shaped to the edge of this guy's head. Same here with this text, yeah? You often see it used in magazine articles, covers, as well as brochures where they have to accommodate illustrations or imagery. And it's done to maintain the page flow. Yeah, some things are important. You've got to fit the text around them. It's just the way it is. It also helps to create a subtle connection between imagery and text. Text outlines, then, are the art of forming text to indicate an image. So you form it into a recognizable pattern and it can instantly get a message or mood across to the audience. So there's that quote about a picture saying 1,000 words. Well, how about 1,000 words making a picture? Abstract, geometric, unrecognizable shapes, they can all convey a sense of excitement or uncertainty. Yeah, so if you've just got random sporadic characters all over the page, but a themed container, such as a heart or like a wine bottle, yeah, full of text, that instantly conveys a specific message. You can push this really far as well. So you can form text to indicate abstract imagery. So the difficult part is pulling it off successfully. You have to connote the text and the images together in a balanced way. And that can only be developed with time and patience. So when it's done right, like in this Scarf of Phrases by Alex Wellinger, even though this text is in German, we can still see that it's text and still apply the same theory to it, yeah? It's clearly meant to be a knitted scarf, but all it is a shape. All it is this, yeah? It's made up of text. There's no way that that indicates a knitted scarf apart from our knowledge that this is how you knit and this loose flowing script that they've got looks like it could be words. Really beautiful, this one. I love it. So abstract type then. When are words not words? So further to our previous exploration of decorative type, text can also be used in a completely abstract manner. So take a step back and consider for a moment that the only reason that we attribute meaning to words is because we as a species have decided that that's a good way to communicate. Yeah, we as a country, in the UK, some parts of the world have all learned that an uppercase A means this noise. Ah. Yeah, and a Q means this noise. K. And a Z means Z. Yeah. But what are they? They're just shapes. They're just lines and circles and squares and triangles and little weird serif shapes, yeah? So if you take a step back, you can then really use some type in a cool, unrecognizable or unique way to convey something completely different. Now, this is a whole thing. You really should go and look into this yourself, but it's cool. I like it. Experiment, encourage, and think outside the text box. I am good. Right. There is so much more to learn. This is really just scratching the surface of typography theory. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of knowledge. There's a lot of cool things in there. And it is definitely a black hole. So if you're interested, dive right in. For now, though, that is plenty. Thank you very much for joining me on this short series into typography theory. And I hope to see you again on another episode of TipTut.
subscribe for more tips, tricks, and tutorials. Thanks for watching.